but we've been talking about the starter market. Obviously, Yamamoto would be so cool. But it looks like the Cardinals are going to have to go through the trade market. They've been linked to the Marlins with Luzardo. They've been linked to the White Sox with Cease. They've been linked to the Mariners a bunch. One fit that I've started like banging this drum a little bit ago. I think the Cardinals and the Tigers they match up so well. And I want to know if you've heard anything that would make any sense. The Tigers have a bunch of like young, controllable starters that I think are cheaper than the guys coming out of Miami or Seattle. And then one other area, and the reason I think they fit a lot better than, for example, the Mariners, is because the Tigers need catching help. Obviously, Eric Haas didn't work out. He's gone now. Jake Rogers doesn't feel like a full-time starter. And the Cardinals, even if it's not Herrera, they have catching depth for days between Crooks, who we've talked about on here before, and then obviously Bernal, guys like Pages, who might not get it done, but that could be something that's really interesting to them in that kind of deal. And the Marlins need some catching help too. But then in that case, you could get one of those guys and you might not have to give up a Donovan or a Gorman. So is there anything you can kind of provide on that?
Yeah, so I think working backward from there, what I would say is that I don't know that the Cardinals really have a lot of what I would say is high-level catching depth at the moment. I think the making the decision they did with Kisner puts them in a spot where they probably can't really trade from a lot of, guys like Crooks and Bernal and guys at that level. That that's the different conversation. And there's a guy who likes their prospect, but the challenge a lot of times with trading catchers at low levels, unless it's sort of like a no doubter with the bat, right? Is that teams prefer generally to hold on to their own guys because they've had them in the pitching system. And like as much as the Cardinals may like Jimmy Crooks, almost everybody thinks they have Jimmy Crooks in their system, right? Like he's a good prospect, but not the kind of standout prospect that maybe you build a deal around. And so, when you look what the Cardinals have with clearly the commitment to Contreras and Herrera at the big league level, it'll be Paje. And then I would suspect that we'll probably see them sign, like a veteran 4A catcher type, a Trace Pereira type, right? That seems like the kind of NRI guy they might bring in to pair with Paje, and then whether that's Nick Trolloc-Iverson or whoever else ends up, at Memphis this year. But, so does that look like a match? Maybe not. Do the Tigers in general look like a match? I think that they might, because the thing that's interesting to me about the Tigers is sort of between them and the Royals, there does appear to be a realization that someone does have to win the AL Central, right?
Somebody does, yeah.
And so whether it's the Tigers kind of having an advancement with their talent or the Royals signing a bunch of free agents. By the way, not the one story, the angle that I've been ready to read about this, the Royals are going to be going to the public for money. Is it in the 04 election, or if it's not 04, it's 06? They're going to be going to the public for money for a new stadium in the next couple of years. That, to me, probably feels a lot like why they're signing free agents and attempting to be competitive, because it's a lot easier to ask for public money for a stadium if you're winning like 79 games versus 59 games, right?
Yeah.
That, to me, in any event, that aside. So, yeah, maybe. The problem, though, is that I think a lot of what the Tigers have seen in terms of progression hasn't really been based on, like, Torkelson and Riley Green. Like, those guys have been okay. But it's been more that young pitching is taking that step, right? Like, and they're kind of building around that pitching. And so to get them to trade from that, I don't know that the Cardinals have a lot, aside from Gorman, I guess, that probably moves the needle in the right way to get the Tigers to break that sort of thing up. Because, I know you and Brendan were talking about Gorman and Donovan, and he and I have had that conversation a million times. And I guess the way I look at it is Donovan, to me, maybe has slightly more value for the Cardinals as currently constructed. But Gorman is a guy who's going to have more around the league and has probably a more rare skill set. As much as Donovan does important things for this team, Gorman's skill set is harder to find. And so he probably is the guy who moves needles when you talk about teams elsewhere.
How much do you think maybe a Thomas Ajayci would play a role in what the Cardinals are thinking about this? Obviously, he's played just mainly at AA. He got the call to AAA this year, but it was very short sample size. But he was amazing this past year, and they think very highly of him. I remember in a chat that Derek Gould did, they talked about how Thomas Ajayci is someone they're not really wanting to listen on. So, I mean, that if they're not listening on him, that means they think highly of him. Do you think that potentially makes them, thinking down the road a little bit, potentially a Gorman or Donovan a little bit more available? Or is that something that they're going to wait? Like, it's nice that they have him, but until he proves himself at the major league level, they're not going to move on from a piece like that because they have that depth.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that I have a hard time imagining JC being included this winter in deals, and that tracks to me because you would at least want him to get to spring, right? He'll be in spring as an NRI, he'll be in big league camp, and so I think we'll see what that looks like when he gets to Jupiter, and he's going to get some reps in spring games, and you're going to see him, in those major league situations in the backfields, right? Like, I think, are you all familiar with the game people call Jupiter Survivor? Have you heard that term before?
No.
So you go through spring training, and it's like the last guy who appears in every spring training game is the Jupiter Survivor. And typically it's going to be a younger guy who plays a lot of positions who they're wanting to see in various spots. Like, I want to say it was Brendan Donovan in 21, maybe. Like, it's guys like that who kind of, my point is, I think JC is a candidate for that probably this spring, right? JC is a guy who we'll see play, I imagine, second, short, third, and maybe even in the corner outfield. That would not totally shock me. And we'll see what he looks like, and we'll see how he kind of responds to the playing time. Because once you get through spring, maybe you have a better idea of, okay, is this a guy who ripped through the Texas League, or is this a guy who legitimately can contribute in the big leagues, this coming season? I don't know that they know that yet. I think that they're maybe optimistic that JC is a guy who they could see on their big league roster. And, I know, like, it's sort of in the same way with Victor Scott, right? And then maybe Scott, they think, is a little bit closer, or at least they have a better idea of how close Scott is to the majors right now. But I think that if you're the Cardinals, would want to see JC in those spots before you were to make some kind of definitive call.
Yeah, I wonder, something that it's been percolating in the back of my brain a little bit, and wonder if you have thoughts about this. I know it's getting a little ahead of ourselves, but especially if the Cardinals don't add a starter the rest of this season, or rest of the offseason, they go into the season with the five they have now and the depth. Do you think, like, the emergence of Scott or JC sometime in the first half could potentially make a Donovan Gorman available, or an Edman available, or Carlson available at the deadline if they're not shopping now? Because if, like, Scott's going to become the center fielder at some point, which again, that's an if, then what is Edman's role? Especially if Wynn's the starting shortstop, or if JC really needs any time, how do you make Donovan Gorman and JC work? Is that something that maybe is in the back of their mind too, of, we could potentially have a plethora of assets at the deadline to go after and make a move bigger than they've done in past deadlines? Or do you, I don't know, maybe that's projecting too far ahead right now?
It's not necessarily too far ahead. I will say that the Edman question to me is separate from the others, because Edman is reliant almost entirely on Wynn, in that Mason Wynn has to be in the big leagues and be productive before they can do anything else with Tommy Edman besides keep him, because there's not really another major league shortstop, right? They just don't have that guy outside of Edman behind Wynn. And so if they're not in a spot with Wynn where he's contributing enough to be in the lineup every day, then Edman is probably held separate from that. In terms of the rest of that, I think that probably is about right. What I would say sort of is that, number one, as you get deeper into the season, you'll have a better idea of whether Gorman is holding up physically or not. If we get into July, if we get 80 games into the season and Gorman has played 55 of them, then we're having a different conversation than if we're 80 games into the season and Gorman has played 77 of them, right? Like, then, that is maybe a different way you kind of look at how he's holding up physically. And frankly, you'll have a better idea of what Donovan looks like, coming back off the surgery. I think it's probably pretty important to remember that he underwent, like, reconstructive elbow surgery, right? Like, there's this assumption that Donovan is going to bounce back in and be perfectly fine. And maybe, that's a surgery that's less traumatic, less stressful for a position player, but it's still a fairly big deal. And, how does the arm hold up over time? Is he able to make the same throws from short and third that he could before, with the same kind of zip? Does he have discomfort while swinging? All of that stuff is going to be part of it. And I think that, if Brendan Donovan comes back and the first half of next year doesn't look like the guy who he was sort of rounding into when he got hurt, that to me isn't a reason to panic, but it is a reason that you probably would reconsider whether you would trade a guy at what could in theory not be his highest value, right? And I think teams who are interested are going to want to see him play as well before they would commit a lot in sort of that direction anyway.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Well, we've talked a little bit. I feel like the starting pitching market, and I feel like all of us would agree, is a little bit more on the speculative standpoint. Obviously, they're open to things, and it could happen, but that's not necessarily the top of the to-do list right now. Maybe it secretly is, but it sounds like it's more bullpen. What are you hearing more on the bullpen standpoint? Yuki Matsui was a name that was talked about a lot. Obviously, it sounds like he's going to the Padres now. What are some of the names potentially percolating here? And then also, I think this is a little bit of a spin on it we haven't talked about, but in terms of like the quality of the bullpen arms, are they looking for one or two high leverage type guys? Are they looking for a high leverage guy and then someone to fill that Chris Stratton, Drew Verhagen type role? Or do they see the Rule 5 and Robertson as those kind of guys? Like, what kind of arms would they be looking for in the bullpen too?
I do think maybe one that's closer to the back end and one that sort of fills that Verhagen Stratton role. I think that maybe it's kind of where they're looking at. I know that Derek Gould, for instance, has reported on their interest in both Phil Maton and Hector Neris. Those are two guys who, to me, maybe Maton is a little better than you would think of that like innings eater guy, and maybe Neris isn't the guy who you would necessarily love to have in your end game mix. But if you got those two guys, for instance, then that draws that more towards the middle as opposed to those two guys being kind of more polarized. The other pitcher that I know that they have had interest in and they have had discussions with is Go Woo-suk, who was a closer in Korea. The interesting thing with Go, and when I've talked to Korean reporters who cover the KBO, obviously much more closer than I do, the thing with him is that he's a free agent next year. And so for him to sign somewhere this year, it would require a posting fee. And the way that the agreement works with Korea, the Korean team is going to have to consent to the posting fee. So basically, it has to be a contract of large enough size to generate enough of a posting fee that his current team, I believe it's LG, would be willing to let him go, right? Because if not, they could just not present him with the posted deal, and then he plays one more season in Korea and is a free agent next winter. And so there is a balance there. He's also on, I believe it's a 30-day clock for pitchers from Korea, and I think he was officially posted the first week of December. So there probably are about 2 weeks or so until we actually know for sure. I have to look up those exact dates, but it's about 2 weeks from now that we'll know for sure whether he's signing with anybody, let alone the Cardinals and MLB this winter or not.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I haven't heard that on the Go standpoint. So that'll be, again, another name to continue to watch. I know we're working backwards a little bit here because we started with the potential trades and all that kind of stuff. But I want to go back to the moves they have made so far. Just in your estimation, you look at where the Cardinals stand today on December 19th, I believe. December 19th. How do you feel about the Cardinals offseason so far? What do you like? I don't know, grades is maybe a hard way to put it, but like, where do you feel like they stand right now? And what would they need to do from now until spring training to put themselves as more of a true contender in the National League? I think most of us would agree maybe they're closer to a playoff team than they were last year now. But I don't know. What do you think that is needed beyond what they've done already? But then also, how do you feel about what they've done already?
So this actually is what I wrote about today for publication tomorrow. And, the way that I framed it is most kids don't get everything they want for Christmas, right? And so when you kind of look at the way this offseason has unfolded, I think when you listen to John Mozeliak talk about what his priorities were in the order of kind of operations here, I think they got a sense pretty early on that the pitching market was going to freeze until something happened with Ohtani, and then everything else kind of trickled downhill from that, right? And I think we've seen that. Like, no Yamamoto yet means no Snell, means no Jordan Montgomery, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that their concerns about being closed out of some of those like bulk inning type guys led them to make the deals they did. Like, I think they're much happier giving Kyle Gibson 1 year and 13 than they would have been giving Michael Waga 2 years and 26, right? I think they're just more comfortable with their investment at this level. Okay, then those moves get done. When you kind of look at some of the projection systems and you kind of compare it to last year, I think it's fair to say that it's very reasonable to expect Lance Lynn to be a pretty significant improvement over Adam Wainwright, or at least the version of Wainwright that we saw last season, right? Even if Lynn is barely better, even if Lynn duplicates last year, that's still 15% better by ERA plus than Wainwright was in 2023, right? He was that bad. So if Lynn improves marginally, he's a big leap over Wainwright. And so then you're looking at, is Kyle Gibson an improvement over Jack Flaherty? And it's probably going to be pretty close. given what the Cardinals got out of Flaherty, especially that spot after he was traded and you dealt with, Hudson and whoever else kind of filling in there, that's going to be close. I think Gibson is at least more reliable. Again, higher floor probably than what you get out of Flaherty, and so that's fair. And so then the conversation is, okay, can Sonny Gray be better than what they got from Jordan Montgomery? Steamer is not optimistic about that. Like, you look at the Fangraphs projections, and they, from a rate perspective, would prefer Montgomery's 23 over Gray's projected 24, basically, right? So it's not entirely clear whether Gray is going to be an improvement over what they got from Montgomery, and more to the point, whether that's enough to turn them from a 71 win team into an 81 win team, let alone a 91 win team, right? And so can you rack up some of that 71 to bad luck, bad sequencing? You can. They played directly to their Pythag last year, but when you look at the ERA, was over like 5.2 in both August and September, and once the deadline passed, not really the same team. You can kind of squidge it. But by and large, by run differential, they got what they deserved last year. That was the team that they were, right? So have they done enough to improve from a last place team to a playoff team? That's tough for me. But if it is the case, it's because the division is not very good, and they got some really bad outcomes last year, and one would assume that they would not duplicate like as many worst case scenarios in 24 that they got in 23.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I feel like a lot of times people get frustrated when people say, what if all these things happen positively? And that never happens. Everything goes right. But few times does everything seem to go wrong either. And that's what felt like it happened to the Cardinals last year, too. So you would think there'd be some positive regression even with the guys they already had last year, let alone the incremental improvements they've made so far. I also think it's interesting, too, whether we agree or disagree with the moves they made. It seems like they've kind of predicted how the market would have gone. They were aggressive getting those Lance Lynn and Kyle Gibson, and for the most part, the guys in that tier have gotten the same type contracts, and we can agree or disagree if those are the right moves, but that's what they did. And then Sonny Gray, again, they jumped the market, and outside of Aaron Nolan going back to Philly, none of the top starters have signed. So I think it's interesting that they've had a good pulse on it so far. It makes me intrigued to see what they do when the market does start to flow again.
Yeah, I think that's entirely fair, and it sort of draws into relief, like, they pegged the market right, and these are the moves they made, right? In correctly assessing what was going to happen, these are the choices they made. It's not like they made these signings and then, oops, things were different. So, that means this was their design. This is what they wanted to happen, more or less, right? Or at least it was what they were comfortable with happening, or they would have, altered it in X, Y, and Z ways. So if that is the case, that's fine. Then they had better be right about the way that is all pointed.
Totally.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch back on the bullpen stuff. Is the Matsui deal to San Diego is official, right?
It hasn't been announced by teams.
Okay.
A reporter in Japan who is a credible reporter in Japan reported it, and I believe Mark Feinsand this afternoon confirmed on his end that it is. I believe it's pending physical. I'm not entirely sure if Matsui is still in the States or if he's gone back to Japan, so he may have to travel to get all that done. But it sounds like that is it's not ink to paper, but it sounds done.
Okay. So I also heard reports. This was kind of shocking to me hearing it. I still don't think it's entirely likely, but that the Cardinals have some like lingering interest in Josh Hader. He's a guy that I feel like would be paid a lot of money, obviously, and he doesn't throw that many. Like he never goes like the 4-out saves, and he doesn't not always available every other day. So it was surprising to me to see that there was some interest in there. Is that report how credible would that report be, and would the Cardinals be actually interested in adding a top end relief arm like him?
I guess for that report to have credibility, what it would say to me is that Hader is not finding the market that he thought he was going to find, and that he is comfortable signing a 1-year deal somewhere.
Yeah,
that would be about the only way that would make sense to me, because I got having an idea sort of how folks around the Cardinals feel about Hader and the way he may or may not fit what they do. I think that your point about his availability is an astute one. I think that when the Cardinals talk about adding back-end arms, what they're talking about really is coming to the realization that Ryan Helsley is not going to be a guy who probably is going to pitch 5 or 6 days a week for them. So they're going to have to live in that world, which means that if they were to acquire another back end arm, it would need to be one that they could trust to sort of fill in, at random and on days where maybe he wouldn't think that guy would be available. So given that Hader, a guy who has such structure to his routine and a guy who is really selective all the times when he pitches, who knows? Now, again, maybe that's different if Hader gets like a big deal somewhere, right? Who can say? But if he's in conversation with the Cardinals, that would be surprising to me. And it would also, to me, say that his market was not nearly as strong as he thought or hoped it might be.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess this maybe kind of goes to the Hader conversation a little bit, but in general, just free agency. Do you what is your pulse right now on the RSN impact on the Cardinals? It feels like there's every week maybe a new update on what's going on with Bally Sports. Now there's talk about Amazon. I think I just saw something about the Diamondbacks potentially buying their own rights back and maybe doing their own network. How much do you think that is still lingering over potential spending? Because it felt like early in the offseason, Gould said they wanted to maybe try to get toward the $200 million threshold. But if this is, I don't know, is this maybe more up in the air than they thought it was going to be going into the offseason? I don't know. What's your pulse right now when and how it terms of spending?
No, I think I don't think that it's any different than I thought it was going to be heading into the offseason. I think that they have probably also pegged that pretty well as well. I don't know that it's probably affected anything that they have done. They have so far said when asked that it hasn't affected them yet. They're not expecting it to have any impact on anything this winter. At the same time, when I asked if there was any circumstance where they would go over the first CBT threshold, the answer I got was that it wouldn't be prudent because of the current economic situation, which is, of course, all about the RSNs, right? So for whatever it's worth, that is at least part of their discussion, even if they're not, eager to frame it that way. I think that the Cardinals will make out better than most, especially when you consider sort of, I believe it was the bankruptcy judge that Diamond went in front of a couple of months ago and it kind of laid out their plan because there was a story in the St. Louis Business Journal about the possibility of Bally's surrendering rights right around maybe September. And the bottom line is that probably, I don't know this to be the case, but my educated guess would be that would be right around the time that a payment would be due to the Blues. So my guess would be that they are going to want to pay the Cardinals to keep the Cardinals on air throughout the summer because the Cardinals are a profit driver for them historically, and then cut and run when it comes time to pay the Blues, right? That's sort of, to me, that reading that report from the Sports Business Journal, that's what that sounded like to me, was that Bally's plan in St. Louis was to just sort of ride out the baseball season and then cut and run before the hockey season. So I think the Cardinals are kind of prepared for that reality. Frankly, the Cardinals are privy to a lot of that in a way that we are not, because the Cardinals have a 30% stake in Bally Sports Midwest, right? That was part of the deal when they signed their TV contract in 2017 or whatever year it was. That was part of the deal, was they acquired a major stake in it. And so they have, I think, probably pretty good understanding of what the financial plans for the network look like. And frankly, look, when they signed that last TV deal, there was a brief exploration with the Blues in looking at a kind of, whether it's marquee or probably a better comparison would be NBC Sports Chicago with the White Sox and the Blackhawks, right? There was some conversation about starting that kind of network. And then the realization came that, frankly, they were probably going to be able to get the asset, i.e. the broadcast rights, for pretty cheap in a number of years when they became bankruptcy assets. They kind of sort of saw all this coming and were strategizing around that. And so when those seemingly inevitably revert to MLB, then okay. I think an important note that, you mentioned that story that Evan Drellick published earlier today on The Athletic about the possibility of Amazon stepping in. As Evan noted, there are only 5 teams for which Diamond holds digital rights. The remaining teams held on to their own digital rights when they negotiated their most recent deals, the Cardinals not being one of the 5, which is to say that if Amazon does start streaming Bally games, it won't be the Cardinals. I think Evan's list was, I know it was the Brewers, I want to say D-backs, Marlins. It was smaller markets, right? It was markets where there would be less leverage. And the Cardinals were not on that list. So the Cardinals have control over their own digital rights. And so, if Amazon wants to stream them, then they're going to have to hash out an entirely separate deal. I think it's much more likely that the Cardinals reclaim them, start their own service and or roll it into whatever MLB does as a central clearinghouse, which is where this is all headed anyway. It's all, whether it's this year or next year or 4 years from now, it's all going to be, you have 20, you can pay $27.99 a month for blackout free Major League Baseball. That's just what it's going to look like. And people are going to hate how expensive it is, but they're going to get access to every game with no blackout, and they're going to be able to probably choose, their own broadcaster. If it's a national game, you can lay the radio broadcast over the video right there in the app. It'll be something like that, and it'll be expensive, but MLB is going to control that direct-to-consumer product.
All right, real quick as we're wrapping up with you, we have a question for you. Basically, if you have a prediction, Cardinals get another starting pitcher, either free agency or trade, who's that going to be?
If the Cardinals acquire, does it have to be in the offseason, or can it be in the middle of the season?
Oh, sure, that's great too. Yeah.
That's it. Here, I'll do both. If the Cardinals acquire another starting pitcher and it is in the offseason, I will say, let's say Edward Cabrera. And if the Cardinals acquire a pitcher during the season, it will be, I'll take the obvious one, and I'll say Dylan Cease. I'll say Cease lasts the winter in Chicago and gets traded in season.
Awesome.
Bold predictions.
All right.
Yeah.
So
again, Jeff.
Really Edward Cabrera sounds really fun. Yeah. I'm back, guys. What's up?
Sandy.
Jeff,
thanks again.
Be the more interesting Marlin. Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah. That's great. Well, Jeff, thanks again for joining us tonight, man. We really appreciate it. You've been a great friend of the podcast. We hope to have you on again sometime soon. Thanks. Have a great rest of your evening.
Anytime, guys. Have fun with Trevor.
Thanks, Jeff.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.